Okay, let's begin our chapter 7, portfolio management strategy. And now let's have a look, 7.2, the active investment strategy. In this 7.2, we will introduce the active portfolio management, active risk and active return, and also the active management strategy. Now let's have a look at the active portfolio management. Compare with the passive portfolio management. The active portfolio management attempt to outperform a passive benchmark portfolio on a risk-adjusted basis by seeking the alpha value, net of transaction cost. So in the active portfolio, it will beat the market and have a higher return than passive market portfolio. And for the active portfolio, it doesn't need to select a appropriate benchmark. And the passive strategy assumes that capital markets are efficient, but active management believe managers are effectively backing the market. So the assumption for these two different methods are different. For the passive, we assume the market are efficient market. And for active portfolio management, we assume there exists some inefficiencies, so the manager could have the ability to explore that inefficiency in the market. Now let's have a look at the active return. The active return, as we mentioned before, is the difference in return between managed portfolio, which is your portfolio return minus the benchmark return. So in the equation, this delta T should equal to your portfolio return minus your benchmark return. And this is your alpha. Okay, now let's have a look at what's the total actual return for your investment. For your investment, if you are doing any strategy, you will get two parts of return. One is based on your beta, so that's your expected return catched from capital assets pricing model. And the other is from your active strategy, you get this alpha. And for this expected return, you can separate as RF plus beta multiply RM minus RF. So this is your risk-free rate plus your risk premium based on your market risk. All this blue part is your passive investment return. Now let's have a look. If you are doing an active investment, not only this passive return you will earn another alpha, like we said, the active return. So if you receive this alpha, the total part is your total actual return. So this red part is your active investment return. So you can know the difference between the active portfolio and passive portfolio management return, what they are. Now let's have a look at the active risk. What's the active risk? We mentioned that before. It is the standard deviation of active return. So we give you one equation to separate our active risk to active factor risk and active specific risk. So the left-hand side of your equation is active risk square. It should equal to your active factor risk plus active specific risk. The active factor risk is a portfolio manager may decide to under or overweight particular industry relative to portfolio benchmark. So that's depend the assets allocation. And the active specific risk, it is the active portfolio manager decide to overweight or underweight individual stock within specific industry. So that's kind of a security selection. So based on the access allocation and security selection, we have different two parts of risk. We will discuss this asset allocation and security selection strategy in the next chapter, chapter 8, for asset allocation. And keep in mind that this is the active risk square, so there is a square in this case. Okay, let me show you one example for the active risk. Now we are using a two-factor model to analyze the performance of 3 actively managed mutual funds. The result of risk decomposition are shown below. So we have 3 different mutual funds, and the active factor for these 3 funds separate to size factor and style factor. And the active specific risk we give you, and active risk square we also give it to you. So the first question is ask you which mutual fund has the highest level of active risk? So remember, active risk square should equal to the active factor risk plus active specific risk. But it asks you the active risk, so we can, based on this active risk square, and give the square root for each one. So we give square root for each one, and then we compare the result for the active risk. We find portfolio C, which is a fund manager C, they have a highest active risk. And the second question is which fund has the highest stale factor risk as a proportion of active risk? So for the stale factor risk, you can directly use this stale factor risk to divide by the active risk. So factor risk divided by active risk, you will get this number. So compare these 3 different numbers, we find the fund A will have the highest level of stale factor. The third question is which fund A has the highest level of size factor risk as a proportion of active risk. The same method you can use, you use the size factor divided by the active risk. You will get the number we find fund C has the highest level. And the last question is which fund has the lowest level of active specific risk as a proportion of active risk. So you use this active specific risk divided by the active risk, you will find the result is fund A. So that's how can we use the decomposition of the active risk and the active factor risk with the active specific risk.